They came with chainsaws before breakfast, roaring through the quiet street like it was a demolition zone. One moment, the gate was standing tall. The next, it was nothing but splinters scattered across the driveway. No warning, no paperwork. Not even a knock on the door, just raw arrogance in matching shirts, acting like they owned the block. From the window, all I could do was watch, my stomach sinking as the wood chips flew. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It felt like a show of power, a test of how far they could push. Would you have stepped outside or stayed hidden and called the cops? Life in our neighborhood used to feel ordinary, almost comfortingly so. The kind of place where the hum of sprinklers marked mornings, the shuffle of joggers, and the sight of kids wobbling down the sidewalks on bikes too big for them. For us, it was a quiet rhythm, a life stitched together by routine. My grandfather would rise early, coffee mug in hand, and take slow laps around the backyard garden he'd tended for years. He liked things simple, neat rows of vegetables, a sturdy fence, and the satisfaction of keeping our corner of the street in good shape. Our home wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. A modest two-story place with faded paint on the shutters, a creaky porch swing, and a fence gate that had stood for longer than most of the neighbors had lived here. That gate was more than wood and hinges. It was a marker of stability, a small piece of our family's history. It had weathered storms, summers of barbecues, and countless visits from friends and neighbors. For Grandpa especially, the gate symbolized boundaries. It was a line between our private life and the rest of the community, a quiet statement that this was our home, our rules inside. The neighborhood itself was friendly on the surface. Families waved when they passed by, holiday decorations appeared. Like clockwork every year, and block parties filled the street with chatter and grilled food. But underneath that layer of suburban normalcy, there were cracks. Whispers of neighbors frustrated with nitpicky rules, small fines over lawn length, or paint colors, and letters left in mailboxes about community standards that felt more like threats than reminders. The HOA wasn't just a committee, it was a looming presence. This watchtower kept track of every flower bed, every parked car, and every deviation from their version of perfect. Grandpa, being old-fashioned, didn't care much for their oversight. He wasn't rebellious by nature, but he valued his independence. He didn't like the idea of anyone dictating what color the shutters should be or how tall the grass could grow. Still, he tolerated it, brushing off the occasional notice with a grumble and a laugh. "They've got bigger things to worry about than my tomatoes," he'd mutter, as though convinced the HOA's eyes couldn't see past his backyard fence. But even with his stubborn calm, I could sense something shifting. Meetings became more aggressive. The newsletters grew thicker, filled with highlighted warnings and vague threats about violations. The once friendly waves from particular neighbors turned into tight-lipped stares, as if everyone was waiting for the next target to be singled out. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control, about proving who really ran the street. And then came the rumors. Whispers about enforcement sweeps, where crews would move through the neighborhood without warning, fixing what they claimed was out of line. Some said they went after unapproved paint colors. Others said they ripped out plants that weren't on the approved list. I brushed it off at first. Stories tend to grow in the retelling, but Grandpa didn't. He'd pause on the porch, sip his coffee, and watch the street with a wary eye. "One day," he said quietly, "they're going to push too far." That day was closer than any of us realized. The fence gate, the same one Grandpa had repaired countless times with his own hands, would soon become the center of a storm we never saw coming. And when it did, our quiet, ordinary life would shatter into something darker, something that made every friendly wave feel like a mask. The truth was, the signs had been there all along. We didn't want to believe them. The first sign that things were changing came in the form of a letter. Not the friendly kind you might expect from a neighbor, but an envelope stamped with the HOA logo and bold red letters across the front. Notice of violation. Grandpa, Found it sticking halfway out of the mailbox one Monday morning, tucked between grocery ads and utility bills. His face tightened as he read, lips pressed into a flat line. The violation? According to the letter, our fence gate, sturdy, weathered, and still standing, was non-compliant with current community standards. The note demanded it be replaced or removed within 30 days, or else fines would be assessed at a rate of $50 per day. It was laughable. That gate had been there longer than most of the HOA board members had lived in the neighborhood. But they didn't care. They had rules printed in glossy handbooks, and Grandpa's gate didn't fit into their picture-perfect vision. At first, he shrugged it off. "I built this gate with my own 2 hands," he muttered, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table. "They'll get bored and move on to someone else." But the HOA didn't get bored. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't just a warning. It was a fine. $350 due immediately, with the threat of legal action if payment isn't received. That's when the harassment began to feel targeted. Suddenly, we weren't just another family on the block, we were under a microscope. One day, it was the gate. Next, a notice about the unapproved height of the hedges. Then, it was improperly stored garden tools, because Grandpa left a rake leaning against the side of the house after working in the yard. It was petty, relentless, and cruel. Neighbors began whispering. Some avoided eye contact altogether, fearing they would draw the HOA's attention themselves. Others quietly sympathized, slipping comments like, "They're going too far," or "They tried that with us last year." But no one stood up. It was easier to stay silent, to let Grandpa fight the battle alone. The pressure mounted with every passing week. The fines stacked higher, the threats grew louder, and the letters became more aggressive. Grandpa, usually calm and even-tempered, began to snap at small things. He'd slam the mailbox shut, curse under his breath, and pace the yard at night as though expecting another ambush. The fence gate became more than just wood. It became a line in the sand. To him, tearing it down would mean surrendering, giving the HOA permission to dictate every inch of his property. And then came the morning that everything shifted. It was barely 8 a.m. when the sound of engines filled the street. I thought it was lawn crews at first, but when I looked outside, I saw a truck parked in front of our house. 3 men in matching polo shirts, clipboards in hand, unloaded chainsaws and heavy gloves. They didn't knock. They didn't explain. They marched straight to the fence gate as if it were theirs to destroy. I froze, heart pounding as I watched from the window. The chainsaw roared to life, drowning out the morning calm. In seconds, wood chips sprayed into the air, the gate splintering under the assault. It was surreal, like watching strangers tear apart a piece of our family history while pretending it was just enforcement. The clipboard man barked orders, nodding with satisfaction as the others cut through the hinges. The time Grandpa stormed out onto the porch, the gate was already half gone. His face was crimson, his hands shaking with fury. He shouted over the roar, demanding to know who authorized this, where the paperwork was, and why they thought they had the right. The men ignored him, acting as though he were just background. Noise. That was the moment something inside Grandpa snapped. This wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about principle, dignity, and the line between a homeowner and a group of self-appointed tyrants. He stormed back inside, his boots thudding across the hardwood. I didn't know what he was planning, but the look in his eyes told me it wasn't going to be quiet. Minutes later, he returned. Only this time he wasn't holding a rake or a hammer. He was dragging something long, heavy, and unmistakable, a relic from his time in the service stored away in the attic for decades. It wasn't loaded, but the sight of it alone was enough to freeze the chainsaw crew mid-cut. Their bravado melted. In an instant, fear flashing across their faces. The street went silent, save for the sputter of the dying chainsaw. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispered from porches, and clutched phones in their hands. Was he serious? Would he really do it? The HOA men backed away slowly, stammering something about just following orders. But Grandpa didn't budge. His voice was calm and measured, yet carried decades of authority as he warned them never to touch his property again without permission. The crew retreated, leaving the gate in ruins, splinters littering the ground like battlefield debris. But the damage had already been done, not just to the wood, but to the fragile peace of the neighborhood. From that day forward, it was no longer just a dispute. It had become something more. It was war. The HOA doubled down, furious at being humiliated. Letters turned into legal threats, fines ballooned into thousands, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some neighbors whispered that Grandpa was dangerous, unstable. Others secretly applauded him, finally seeing someone stand up to the HOA's bullying. The board called emergency meetings, vowing to restore order and protect the community. But Grandpa wasn't backing down. He patched the gate as best he could, hammering the wood back into place with his own hands. It wasn't pretty, but it stood. Every nail he drove into the splintered frame was a statement. You don't own me, and you don't own this home. The tension spread beyond our property. HOA patrols began roaming the neighborhood more frequently, stopping in front of houses for long, silent minutes as though searching for their next target. The air grew thick with paranoia. Neighbors whispered at block parties, some siding with the HOA, while others secretly cheered on Grandpa. The street that once felt like a community now felt like a chessboard, with every house a piece in a larger game of control. Then came the escalation that no one saw coming. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, someone spray-painted "Comply or Pay" across the side of our fence. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message, a warning. Grandpa stood in front of it the next morning, jaw clenched, eyes dark. He didn't say much, but I could feel the weight of it in the silence. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. From that point on, every day felt like walking on a fault line. HOA inspectors circled like vultures, neighbors grew more divided, and Grandpa grew more determined. The battle over a simple gate had spiraled into something bigger, something that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of the neighborhood. And as much as I wanted to believe it would calm down, deep down, I knew the worst was still ahead. Because when people in power feel challenged, they don't retreat, they escalate. And the HOA was about to prove just how far they were willing to go. The breaking point came on a blistering summer afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy and tempers burn faster than the sun overhead. By then, the battle with the HOA had dragged on for months. Fines had piled into the thousands. Letters arrived daily, and the ruined gate had become both a symbol of defiance and a target for continued harassment. The HOA wanted compliance, and Grandpa's stubborn refusal to bow had turned into an obsession for them. That morning, a certified envelope arrived, stamped, sealed, and official. Grandpa opened it at the kitchen table, his calloused fingers trembling ever so slightly. Inside was a legal notice. The HOA had filed a lien against our property. If the fines weren't paid in full, they had the authority to seize the house. Our house, the place Grandpa had poured his life into, the garden, the fence, the porch, where he drank his morning coffee. It all hung in the balance, reduced to a bargaining chip in a game of power. I'll never forget the look on his face as he read the letter. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was something more profound, heavier, a mix of betrayal and resolve. They weren't just tearing down a fence anymore. They were trying to erase him, to erase us. The tension boiled over that very evening. The HOA had scheduled an emergency community meeting to discuss ongoing violations and disruptive behavior. Everyone knew who they meant. The entire neighborhood gathered in the community center, a sterile room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air was thick with curiosity, whispers bouncing off the walls as people speculated about what was coming. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, 5 members perched behind a long table draped with a white cloth. In the center was the president, a man with a smug smile, a pressed suit, and the cold confidence of someone who believed the rules bent in his favor. His name was Carter, and he was the architect of nearly every letter, every fine, every threat that had landed in our mailbox. When Grandpa walked in, the room fell silent. He wasn't dressed for a fight, just his work boots, a faded flannel shirt, and the posture of a man who refused to be broken. He took a seat near the front, eyes locked on Carter like he was already bracing for war. The meeting began with pleasantries, the board rattling off updates about landscaping budgets and pool repairs, but everyone in the room was waiting for the showdown. Finally, Carter cleared his throat and shifted the conversation. "We have one pressing matter tonight," he said, his voice oily and condescending. "The continued non-compliance of Mr. Thompson regarding his property's fence and other numerous violations." He gestured toward Grandpa as though presenting evidence to a jury. Despite repeated notices, fines, and opportunities for correction, Mr. Thompson has refused to abide by community standards. His actions are disruptive, costly, and set a dangerous precedent for our neighborhood. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded along, others frowned in disapproval, and a few avoided eye contact altogether. Carter continued, pulling a stack of papers from a folder. "As of today, the fines total $14,600. A lien has been placed on the property. If payment is not received within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings may begin. This is not a threat, it is the law." He leaned back in his chair, smugness radiating from every inch of him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Grandpa stood. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the center of the room, his boots echoing against the linoleum. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "You've sent your letters. You've sent your fines. You've sent your men with chainsaws to tear apart what I built with my own hands," he said, his voice steady, carrying, across the room without a microphone. "And now you want to take my home, my land, the place where I raised my family, the place where I've spent every day of my life since I came back from serving this country." Gasps echoed through the room. Some neighbors leaned forward, others shifted uncomfortably. Carter smirked, clearly waiting for him to falter, but Grandpa didn't falter. He reached into a worn leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers of his own. "What you didn't count on," he said, slamming them down on the board's table, "is that I kept records too. Every letter, every violation notice, every photograph of the so-called problems you claimed needed fixing. And right here," he tapped, "one page with a firm finger, is proof that your chainsaw stunt violated not only your own bylaws, but county property damage laws." The room erupted into whispers. Carter's smirk faltered. Grandpa wasn't done. "You call me non-compliant. You call me disruptive. But the truth is, you're bullies hiding behind clipboards. You fine people for flowers that aren't on your list. You threaten families over garden gnomes. You terrorize this community with your power trips and pretend it's about standards. Well, tonight, everyone's going to see the truth." With that, he pulled out his final weapon, a flash drive. He handed it to the meeting moderator, a reluctant neighbor tasked with running the projector. Within seconds, images filled the screen at the front of the room. Photos of the chainsaw crew hacking down the fence, along with footage captured from a neighbor's security camera, showing them laughing as they left the debris behind. The audience gasped, voices rising in outrage. The images shifted, letters demanding money, contradictions between different notices, and even a leaked email thread between board members mocking Old Man Thompson and plotting ways to make an example of him. The effect was electric. The neighbors, who had once avoided eye contact, were now sitting upright, angry, and murmuring among themselves. Someone shouted, "This is harassment!" Another yelled, "You can't do that!" Carter's face turned crimson. He tried to regain control, pounding his gavel against the table. "This is out of order. These materials are not admissible." But the room wasn't listening anymore. The dam had broken. Years of frustration with the HOA's petty tyranny came pouring out. Neighbors stood and began recounting their own grievances: unfair fines, invasive inspections, intimidation tactics. The board that once ruled with silence and fear was suddenly drowning in the noise of rebellion. Grandpa stood in the center, calm amid the storm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth had done the work for him. The climax came when one neighbor, a quiet woman from 3 houses down, stood up and said what everyone was thinking. If they can do this to him, they can do it to any of us. "Enough is enough. I motion to remove the board." The room exploded in cheers, shouts, and applause. Carter's face twisted in panic, his control slipping through his fingers. He tried to call for order, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Grandpa turned to face him, his voice low, but cutting through the chaos. "You thought you could break me, but all you did was show everyone who you really are." The vote wasn't official yet, but the outcome was inevitable. The board had lost the community's trust. Carter's empire of fines and threats was collapsing in real time, right there under the fluorescent lights. And as Grandpa walked out of the meeting, shoulders squared, the entire room rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cheered, others nodded, in quiet solidarity. For the first time in months, he didn't look like a man fighting alone. He looked like the spark that had ignited a fire. But even as the celebration began, I knew this wasn't the end. Carter and his allies weren't the kind to go down quietly. The war wasn't over. It had simply shifted to a new battlefield. And what came next would decide not just the fate of our family, but the future of the entire neighborhood. The days that followed the community meeting felt strangely calm, almost like the quiet after a storm. For months, we'd lived under the constant pressure of fines, threats, and fear. Now, suddenly, the street felt lighter. Neighbors who had once avoided our eyes stopped by to talk, to share stories, to admit that they, too, had been cornered by the HOA's relentless grip. It was as if one spark had lit up years of frustration, and the fire was still burning. Grandpa, though, didn't strut or boast. That wasn't his way. He went back to his routine, watering the garden in the morning, hammering the fence into sturdier shape, sitting on the porch with his coffee. But there was a shift in his presence. His shoulders sat a little straighter. The weariness in his eyes seemed to have lightened. He'd stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been too afraid to do the same. The HOA board didn't collapse overnight, but cracks spread quickly. Within a week, 3 of the 5 members resigned under pressure from the community. Carter clung to his position like a drowning man grasping for driftwood, but even his allies began to abandon him. The leaked emails, the images of the chainsaw, crew, the testimonies from neighbors, there was no patching that hole. By the end of the month, a formal vote was called. The board was dissolved, and an interim committee of residents, real neighbors, not power-hungry tyrants, was established. The lien against our property dropped. The fines erased. In fact, several families who had been bullied into paying. Thousands were refunded. What was once a fortress of intimidation had turned into rubble. From it, the neighborhood began to rebuild something healthier, more human. But victory didn't erase the scars. The fence gate, no matter how carefully Grandpa repaired it, would never look the same. Its jagged edges and patched boards told the story of what had happened, a visible reminder of the line that had been crossed. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, I could still see the moment the chainsaw tore through, still hear the roar, still feel the shock in my chest. Grandpa refused to replace it entirely. "It stands as it is," he said firmly one morning when I suggested building a new one. "This isn't just a gate anymore. It's proof that we didn't back down." Neighbors began to see it the same way. Children walking to school would stop to run their fingers across the rough boards as though touching history. Adults who had once been silent nodded in quiet respect when they passed. It became less of a fence and more of a monument. One man's stubborn line in the sand that had forced an entire community to reckon with itself. The long-term changes rippled outward. The new interim committee rewrote the bylaws, stripping out the most absurd and petty rules. Gone were the fines for garden, gnomes, the bans on unapproved flower colors, and the harassment over lawn height. In their place were simple, fair guidelines meant to keep the neighborhood clean without stripping away individuality. For the first time in years, the HOA actually served the people instead of lording over them. Some families who had nearly sold their homes out of frustration decided to stay. Others, who had been quiet for too long, found their voices again. The block parties that had once been stiff and tense turned lively, filled with laughter and music instead of suspicious glances. It was as if a weight had lifted, and people remembered what community was supposed to feel like. As for Carter, the man who once strutted with smug authority, he vanished almost overnight. Rumors swirled. Some said he sold his house and moved away. Others claimed he stayed but never showed his face in public again. No one knew for sure, and no one seemed to care. His name became a cautionary whisper, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. But the impact on Grandpa was the part that stayed with me most. He had always been a quiet man, content to tend his garden and sip his coffee. Yet when pushed, he became something else, a shield, not just for us, but for everyone around him. The neighbors who had once dismissed him as a stubborn older man now sought his advice, his perspective. He didn't relish the role of leader, but whether he liked it or not, that's what he'd become. I asked him once, months later, if he'd ever been scared. He didn't answer right away. He stared out at the patched gate, at the garden beyond, at the street that had once been lined with fear. Then he said, "Of course, I was scared. Fear is what tells you what's worth fighting for." His words stayed with me because the truth was, this was never just about a fence. It was about control, about dignity, about whether ordinary people would allow themselves to be pushed around in their own homes. The HOA thought they could break us with fines and threats. Instead, they taught us how strong we could be when we refused to yield. The story spread beyond our neighborhood. Local news stations picked it up, framing it as a battle of one homeowner against an overreaching HOA. Reporters came to film the ruined gate, to interview Grandpa on his porch. He hated the cameras but tolerated them, constantly redirecting the attention back to the bigger picture. This isn't just about me. This is about every family that's ever been told they don't have a say in their own home. The coverage sparked something larger. Other communities began reaching out, sharing their own stories of unfair fines, petty harassment, and overzealous boards. Some even used Grandpa's stand as inspiration to challenge their own HOAs. He never set out to be a symbol, but that's precisely what he became, a reminder that even ordinary people, when pushed far enough, can change the rules of the game. Looking back, it's easy to see the arc of it all, the setup, the rising action, the confrontation, the collapse. But living through it, it felt like walking through fire without knowing where the flames would end. And that is what made the outcome so powerful. Not just that the board fell, not just that the fines disappeared, but that we discovered something we didn't know we had: resilience. The final irony is that the very thing the HOA tried to destroy, the gate, became the symbol of our survival. Grandpa never rebuilt it into something pristine. He let the scars show. He wanted everyone to see the cracks, the splinters, the places where it had been broken and repaired, because that's what we were too, not flawless, but stronger for having endured. As for me, I can't walk past that gate without remembering the roar of the chainsaw, the arrogance of the clipboard men, the weight of fear as I watched from the window. But more than that, I remember the silence that followed. The moment when Grandpa stood his ground, when one man's refusal to be bullied ignited an entire neighborhood. So what's the takeaway? It could be this: power only lasts as long as people are willing to give it. The moment someone says enough, the whole structure begins to crack. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They thought they could grind one man into compliance. Instead, they exposed themselves, and in doing so, they lost everything. And maybe the question to ask isn't whether you would have stepped outside that morning or whether you would have called the cops. Perhaps the real question is this: when someone comes for what matters most to you, not just your property, but your dignity, your freedom, will you be ready to stand your ground? Because sometimes all it takes is one person, one refusal, one scarred old fence gate to remind a community what it means to fight back.